So good morning, everyone. I'd like to echo something that Tom said. Thank you all very much for being here. It is hard to believe it's been 3 years since we've all gotten together physically, and it's been really great to see some folks. I know that when I got started getting ready for this, unlike the dapper gentlemen that were up here previously, I found out that I had a lot of trousers that didn't quite fit. So I had reached their facility limit, so to speak. But I got here and there was a gym. I found a gym. It was right back there. And I walked in there and I saw those machines. And at first it was kind of terrifying and intimidating. But I said, Phil, you can do this. So I went through there and I looked around and I found a machine that would help me out. It does an upper body workout. And you kind of get comfortable standing in front of it, and then you wave your hands, and then it spits out a paper towel to wipe the sweat off your face. So I did 10 reps on that. I was exhausted, so I took a shower, took a couple Advil, and so I'm all ready to go. So I'd like to talk about facility rating. First, I want to make a little apology about the title here. I'm going to be followed up. This presentation will be followed up after lunch with a presentation on lessons learned. And in that lessons learned, they'll be talking about a document that came out last week officially, the Aero Enterprise Themes and Best Practices for Sustaining Accurate Facility Ratings. So compared to that document, my title of accuracy is a little bit off. What I'm going to be talking about is some issues that we have seen in the West that have caused a little bit of conflict, and basically try to educate you in a couple of cases, let you know that, hey, we've changed. We've taken a different tact on a couple of these elements. And on some of them, we have, I'm going to try to explain to you the WEC auditor perspective of why we're looking at things the way we are. And maybe if you understand it, you understand we're not asking for something that you cannot do. It might seem like we're going a little bit beyond, maybe we are, but I'm hoping that I can spend some time explaining where we're coming from so you can understand, sympathize, and maybe even get on board with the way we're approaching these things. So first of all, these are the recent FAC issues that we're seeing in the West. And when I say issues, these are areas that auditors have determined potential non-compliances in these areas. And so we need to try and address those because we're seeing it's more than just a one-off. One of them is correct and complete identification of facilities. And the issue with that is a difference of opinion on what is a facility. What auditors consider jointly owned facilities, and although I uppercased it here, jointly owned facilities is not a defined term in the NERC glossary. So it's sort of left up to some interpretation about what it means. Some weaknesses in methodologies, and basically I'll just touch on that a little bit with respect to ambiguities that you build into your own methodologies. Allowance for mechanical devices in FAC 8, and aggregation of resources. And those last two there primarily for the generator operator benefit. So ambiguity, FAC 8 is a two-edged sword. On one hand, it's written to allow flexibility in determining your ratings, but at the same time it allows flexibility, it ends up being ambiguous in some areas. And that can result in different perceptions from one owner to another owner, from one function to another function, and worse, from an auditor to an entity. So what is solely owned? I think everybody probably understands that, but it's always used in the same sentence with jointly owned. And so that's something we want to talk about a little bit. What is a facility rating and who cares? And why does a TO need a methodology, but a GO doesn't need a methodology? What's the magic there? Sometimes the GO does need a methodology. And why? What's the big point about this methodology thing? And does it matter if it's not connected in series? There is an emphasis, even if you look in the RSAW, FAC 8, they'll say there's an emphasis on series connected components. So what about things that aren't in series? How do those get addressed? So really FAC 8 should be a pretty simple requirement for a couple reasons. One is although there's 5 requirements now, there's really only 3. The first 3 requirements are just guidance on how you do your process, on how you develop your process. So it tells you develop a process, has to include a few items, and then you've just written your standard. So you are the author of your methodologies or your process. And then our 6 is just apply your own process and come up with a facility limit. And then the last one, our 8, is just communicate that when requested. You don't even have a firm time period there. It's based on a request from whoever needs that facility rating. So it should be simple. But I don't want to oversimplify it. It says, I'm Mr. Einstein there, said in theory and practice to be the same. In practice, they're not. And that is no more true than in FAC 8. And the challenge is why that is because of the sheer number of pieces of equipment. I almost wish FAC 8 were named equipment ratings rather than facility ratings. It might clear things up a lot. But there's anything that can be removed, that can be unbolted and taken out of a power system, technically should have a rating to know if it can carry the current that it was intended to current when you put it in there. That's bus links, breakers, wave traps, jumpers, everything. So there's a lot of stuff to keep track of. And there's many ways to arrange them. So you get all this equipment together, and now you can put it together in any sort of arrangement. Parallel connected, series connected, shunts. All this stuff comes into perspective when you're trying to determine what your facility ratings are. And then things are changing frequently. Maybe not for a really small system, but for large systems, there's always projects going on. There's always upgrades. There are, damage. A transformer gets replaced. Transformers have a long lead time. So you borrow a transformer or get a transformer. What are the odds it's going to be rated exactly the same with the same cooling capacity? Maybe, but maybe not. So how do you account for all these changes that are going on and keeping your facility ratings documents alive so that they remain accurate? And then multiple options are permitted. As you know, if you look at that requirements 1, 2, and 3, they give you, you can use nameplates. You can use a method that's been approved by the IEEE. You can use a test. You can use an engineering evaluation, or you can use a performance, historical performance. All those are acceptable ways to determine facility ratings. Now, auditors really prefer the nameplate rating, but all of those are acceptable. But if you're not clear in your methodology, it's a free-for-all. So you've got to specify which one of those you will use and which one you won't. And so here the breakdowns are. Biggest one probably we're seeing is auditor not agreeing with your definition of a facility. So you say, this is my facility, I'm happy. You usually typically base it on your ownership. You take it out to where you have control. This is my facility. And the auditor says, no, you didn't include these other things. And by the way, that makes it a joint owned facility. So right there, that's an issue that comes up. The second bullet there, omission of elements in the facility, that's assuming you don't have a disagreement with the auditor, that you actually know what your facility is, but you just haven't walked down and validated, so you've left something out. You left a wave trap out, or you identified something but got the wrong rating for it, or you didn't follow your own process. And we've seen this a couple of cases where entities have actually improved their process, but they failed to address the fact that they have a whole bunch of facilities rated in accordance with the old process, and there was no transition allowed. So you can shoot your own self in the foot if you're not careful when that occurs. And didn't consider other owners' equipment when you were looking at a joint owned facility. And then lack of documentation. I'm not really going to talk about that. That is a common thread for almost any standard. PRC 5, the SIP standards, documentation is always a challenge. So that one's not unique to FAC 8. It is just one of the things that we do see. So I want you to keep this in mind. This is the purpose of FAC 8. And sometimes we get so involved in the individual requirements, we forget, we don't see the forest for the trees. The facility rating is to ensure that these facility ratings, this standard is to ensure facility ratings used in the reliable planning and operation, I bolded that, of the bulk electric system are determined based on technically sound principles. In other words, a basis for how you're operating your system and planning your system. Now that second sentence, a facility rating is essential for the determination of system operating limits. That's true. I don't know how it really applies to this facility rating. Once you get a good facility rating, you can use it for generation dispatch. You can use it for an SOL. You can use it for everything. It is true. You need a facility rating for SOLs. But the emphasis of this statement here is on that first part. And so give some thought to who the end user of your facility rating is. So I got a question before the start here. How many people have heard of FERC Order 881? Come up. Okay, so how many of you think that you're going to have to change your facility rating methodology in order to accommodate FERC 881? Yeah, there's a few that I've recognized. So understand, we looked at FAC 8, and there is nothing in FAC 8. There's two things 881 is going to require you to do. It's going to require you to do ambient adjusted ratings for your facilities. And that this order, by the way, is directed for open access tariff. It's not a reliability standard type rating. It's not directed towards reliability standards itself. But the TOs that determine these ratings, FAC 8 is their tool that they do that for. We don't think FAC 8, as it is right now, prohibits incorporating all the requirements for 881. You can, FAC 8 already says to consider ambient conditions when you're doing your ratings. Doesn't say how often, but it says you can consider those ambient conditions. It already says you're supposed to address emergency ratings and normal ratings. So there's nothing in FAC 8 that prohibits you from modifying your methodologies to satisfy 881 for your tariff people. But this is the point. They have a need that may not be accordance with your facility ratings methodology right now. So you got to look at your customer. You got to look, what is the end result? Is it the TOP that needs it for an SOL? Is it your transmission salespeople, your providers that need it for their tariff? Is it your balancing authorities that need it for generation dispatch purposes? There's a lot of different customers that you may have that all come under the scope of planning and operation of the system. So facility ratings is a pretty big thing and pretty basic. So this is a definition of facility. This, I'm not going to read this one. I think everybody pretty much knows this, but it does cause a little bit of issues. I really wonder when they actually dreamt up the facility rating standard, if they really intended it to mean this uppercase F. I know FERC didn't. FERC order, they used lowercase. But this is what we did. And it does cause a little bit of issues because we're narrowing down what we cover by FAC 8 to only those elements that we can identify as a facility. But it includes, what does operate as a single element mean? Does it mean open and close a breaker, turn a circuit on or off? Does it mean moving a phase shifter? If you're moving a phase shifter, is that not operating something? So does it mean monitoring? Does it mean a RAS, putting a RAS on? Is that operating a system? So a little bit of ambiguity there of what operate a single element might mean to be interpreted by different folks. Who gets to decide how I operate my equipment? I mean, does the auditor get to tell me how I'm operating my equipment? Can a facility include both a generator and transformer? Since those are explicitly identified with a comma in the definition, but yet R1 definitely includes a generator and transformer together in the same facility. Is a WEC path with multiple lines considered a facility? I think not, but it's a question that could come out. So we're going to talk about two big perspectives of looking at facilities, not the FERC 881 issue, which is a different customer, but there are two basic groups. And it's the planning and the operations. So from a planning perspective, they like to look at a facility kind of like this drawing, node to node. They're concerned about those lines between the dots. They put this into a model so that they can assess flows in the model. They can take one of those lines out or two lines out and look at the contingency, see how that shifts flows. So they're looking at it static and then remove something, try to break, see what's going to change flows, and do those flows meet those facility limits that have been published. So it's very important for them to know what the real limits are, because when they do these contingencies, they won't really know, do we have a problem here, or was there slop built into this? Or do we have the right numbers? And if you don't have the right numbers and don't have the right facility limits, then all your predictions for your contingencies and events are not going to be accurate. So from planning perspective, that's what they want to know. And this is a little sub piece there of it. They're really interested in that line and that connection. And you'll see that when WEC auditors are auditing you, that's where our sampling basis, we look at lines. We very rarely include individual piece of equipment and buses and part of our samples. We're looking at transmission lines, generate connections, things like this, and this is what we sample and ask for. So that's what they want to know. It's the link. They're looking for the weak link in the chain. But operators, they need something more. I'm not a planner. I used to be an operator. And operators, it's very important for operators to know what's inside those dots. It's not that the limits between two switch yards isn't important. Once those get converted into an SOL, operators have to monitor them. But storms come, outages come. Operators have to get around inside these switch yards and do some switching. And they need to know that as they're rerouting power within their facilities, does the equipment support that? So the operator's perspective is more like this. They're looking at, hey, what's going on with these inside all these switch yards? Do all those components support the current flow that I'm going to be putting through them under these various conditions? It adds complexity. And so what definition of facility really works for an operator? So we have this dilemma, and everybody's seen this little cartoon before, that you need to look at the whole picture. You can't just go look at an isolated piece and determine what is there. And what makes it even worse for auditors here is that in addition to only one entity looking at the tail and not knowing what the trunk is doing, this is also separated by time. We're looking at one entity, looking at one piece of this animal 1 year, and we may not get around to auditing that partner, the connected piece, for another 3, 4, or 5 years. So this is the chance when we go to audit them, this is a chance that we get to try and put this together. So we can't see beyond what you show us, and that might not be enough. Auditors don't get a comfortable feeling if you say, well, this is the rating that we're providing and it's only going halfway down this line. Do you agree with your partner? Is that the real rating? Does a person on the other end have a different rating? So our process in WEC, and I think the rest of the regions are, in fact, I know the rest of the regions are on board with this. They want to look at that whole facility on a transmission basis. They want to see the whole facility going from one place to another and make sure both entities coordinate and agree with that facility rating. So how do we do that? How does the auditor do that when we're only looking at one entity? And so we ask what's on the other end, and we ask that you coordinate and obtain information from that partner on the other end of the line. Our approach is that we're going to consider a facility to extend through the breakers that isolate that facility. That's a call that we've made. Some agree, some disagree, but understanding how we look at this might help out. The operating isolation device breaker, or a MOD, is considered part of the facility. So that's where we're drawing our picture and our boundary to keep in mind when you're getting ready to show this to an auditor. So the next few slides I've got are going to show a few configurations and some thought process, and I hope it kind of justifies why this approach should be acceptable and why it works and helps. Even though you could say, well, I disagree. I think that I want to make my bus a different facility. And the problem is then we would have to go sample every piece of your bus in order to find out what those facility ratings are. So that's why we're approaching this way. And it's hopefully will give a justification to our breaker to breaker approach. So here's the first and the most simple. perspective, a single bus. And so this shaded area is what WEC would consider that facility, of course, also extending and be the same picture on the other end. And that would be that line facility, whatever its name may be. Now, realistically, series components, that anything on the other side of that line going up to that bus could also limit that flow. So look how slack we are. We're not even looking back to all the way to the bus to that facility. We're going back through the breaker. But you guys, you folks that are doing the facility limits, you should consider all that. You probably do. It's just a matter of, do you document that somewhere? Such as an officer, if an auditor did say, hey, what about this disconnect on the upstream side? Even if you don't consider that in your facility, that's a fair question. Different facility possibly, but you still should have a rating for it. So when you're getting your information together, it's fine to define your facility up through the breaker, but you should also have documentation for those other pieces. That makes that complete. That makes that facility absolutely complete in your eyes, and nothing gets missed. Main and transfer bus, and what we're looking at now is that red line coming off the top. So a main and transfer bus, you're going to be on the main bus, 95% of the time, 98% of the time. So there's not a huge risk that you're going to be limited and have to set a rating based on going through the aux bus or the transfer bus, but it's possible. So the auditors, this is their default. That's what they're going to consider. You should think of as the rating is from the main bus breaker out through the line and then of course to the other end. But you should, like I say, you should also consider those other series components that could limit that facility, just to make sure that you're good. And then most auditors in WEC would, if they saw this arrangement, they would ask, what about this transfer bus? What if you're powering that line from the transfer bus? So in this case, you give them this information here of these facility elements. That's fine. You can still rate it based on the main bus, but they just want to be aware this is the kind of thing that would be built into a procedure for your operators is when they're transferring around. Is there no concern over the flow going through that transfer breaker? What if you're having to provide 2 circuits instead of 1? So that information, that rating information needs to be there somewhere. So the auditors will explore that and ask about that rating. If you do all that, if you go and you get all this information and the auditors, even though they're just sampling, but they pick a sample and they include all the breakers, then the only thing that's left out of the sampling process as far as auditors having reasonable assurance is, well, we didn't ask about the main bus. But that's pretty much, and this is true for all other bus configurations also, main buses there's a very low risk that your facility is limited by the main bus inside a switch yard. So we're covering most of the risky bases. We're focusing on the risk elements by including the breakers, the drops equipment, the terminal equipment for the breakers and everything in there, even if it goes out to 2 breakers. Because here we have a ring bus. Same basic story. The shaded area is what the operators are going to consider the boundaries of a facility, and then again extending out with the arrow out to the other bus. That's what they're going to be looking at. It's going to expect it for you to consider in the facility rating. Now, your methodology can determine when you look at those 2 breakers, whether you're going to look at it and say, I'm going to assume the most limiting of those breakers or the single breaker, or you can say, hey, these breakers together handle that flow. And I'm assuming 50-50 flow, 60-40 flow. That's part of your methodology, is how you want to address those 2 breakers for impacting that rating. You have that control, but not considering those breakers. I made the assumption one time that, oh, no one would ever make a breaker that wouldn't handle the line facility. I was wrong. There are situations out there where we have 1 or 2 breakers that are rated less than the conductor on the line. So we can't make any assumptions. So we need to ask. Same thing goes here. If you look at each one of these facilities, if we're sampling, doing a sample of each facility, by going on this breaker to breaker method, there's enough overlap there that we have eventually, we've essentially covered that whole bus, except for the main pieces on the end, which low risk that's going to be a limiting element. Double breaker, same story. Still consider both of the breakers there. So this is the one caused lots of trouble. This is the one that there's a lot of issues with. Generator connection facility. And I'm not going to talk about the generator facility itself. That's to the I'm saying left of this drawing. That's defined in R1, and it's really pretty clear that it's going to be the generator and the transformer, the GSU, if you own the transformer, the GO owns it. If the GO owns it, then it's just the generator, even though there's not a breaker in there. All there is maybe is an isophase bus. But that's the way that we're allowing R1 to be R1. Complications are in the R2 side, if the generator owner owns connection facilities up to the transmission side. So the default is, as I said, we're going to be looking through the breaker. So if you have a breaker in this case right here, and the generator owner owns that piece, he would be subject to R2. And you'd need to define, you'd have the methodology and have to rate that equipment there, but we'd go it up through that breaker. Unless they owned equipment farther, then anything else they owned would also be included. The tricky part, the trouble one that's causing the most issue is this configuration right here, where the generator owner technically say owns that line going from the generator up to the bus. Maybe they own the terminal equipment, maybe they don't. But then that bus is owned by the TO. It's actually owned by the transmission owner. It's not the GO's equipment, but we're still considering that generating facility, that connection facility is going through those breakers, because we believe those breakers can legitimately limit the output of that generator. And we're auditing the generator at this time. We're not auditing the TO, so we can't go call the TO and check and see. So the auditors, if they want a comfortable feeling of reliability, if these ratings are done correctly, they need that information. So we're going through and including those buses, which makes it incumbent on the generator owner to coordinate with the TO that he's connecting to and get those ratings so that that whole generator connection can be an accurate and complete facility rating. Now, this is a case where WEC is not necessarily in full alignment with the rest of the regions. The regions don't have a huge problem with this, but in some cases they will allow more flexibility and say, you know, well, if they only want to go up to the bus and not include the breakers, they'll allow that flexibility in some cases. We're not at this time. So that's the way it is. We've talked about it. We've thought, hey, what are the pros and cons of doing it? And at this time, this is our perspective on it. So jointly owned facilities, and before we talk about this, that's what brings in that last situation is what brings in these surprise jointly owned facilities a lot of times. And I don't want to, what I say here, you have to take this with a grain of salt, because there is a SAR project out there right now. There is a drafting team formed and actively thinking, they have their thinking caps on, and they're working on modifying FAC 8 to address more specifically jointly owned facilities. Whether that's going to be done through a definition in the glossary, whether it's going to be done through a definition in the standard itself, or whether it's going to include things that will clarify what the intent is. So anything I say about this right now, understand this, a standard could change that. But I want the main part here is the first thing you have to do in any case is define the facility, get the facility defined right. Once you define the facility, then you ask the question, who owns it? Who owns the components? If you are the only owner, it's a solely owned facility. There's no jointly owned involved. If you're not, if any other piece of equipment has another owner, if you can't sell that whole thing yourself, it's a jointly owned facility. That's our perspective. And it comes in two flavors. One of them is traditional way, the shared ownership thing. If you have a 50% ownership in a component, a transformer or a conductor, and the other is what I call a connected connected joint ownership. So if there's a shared ownership, one of the owners has to step up and have the rating. It has to be included rating. So one owner must do it. One registered owner has to include that in his facility ratings. For connected joint ownership, to say here, when another registered entity solely owns one or more components of the facility that are directly connected to each other, WEC's approach is that all registered owners must coordinate and communicate such that the most limiting element is known. And the resulting facility rating is known by all registered owners and agreed that they're operating to the same facility limit. That is what gives us a certain amount of comfort that the system can be operated reliably, that facility rating can be used in an open access tariff. It can be used to make an SOL. It can be used to put in a planning standard, and it will work. So requirement 2, this is an issue we get a lot of people pointing out about the fact that requirement 2 explicitly says that generators should have a methodology, and it specifies from the location specified in R1 to the point of interconnection with the transmission owner. Well, here we go again. Point of interconnection, not officially defined. So you got anybody calling it whatever they want. In general, it's an agreed upon term in an interconnection agreement between the generator owner and the transmission owner. But this is identifying where the methodology for the GO, it must include the equipment in there. WEC's perception right now is that it does not define the facility. It defines what your methodology has to cover. So it's a contractor identified point, doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily defining a facility. As I said, we take it through the breakers. So you get all that together and you get to requirement 6. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about requirement 8. That's just communicating the ratings on, as requested. You don't really see too much issues with that. But you've got to use these methodology or whatever to come up with your facility rating. And what we look for is list facilities, one or more rating values, normal, emergency. At this time, we have a lot of companies that rate them the same. I think there'll be less of that once they fully incorporate FERC 881, but maybe not for a generator. Sometimes if the emergency rating higher than what the generator can put out may not be appropriate. And there is some wiggle room in 881. It has to comply with your facility ratings methodology, whichever one you use. So that we're going to look and say, hey, is this rating, did you do what you said you're going to do to get this rating? And then supported by documentation for R1, and actually also supported by documentation for R2 and 3 also. The issue of compliance with methodology and the weaknesses we see are, you write your methodology, you look at the standard, and the standard gives you 3 or 4 different ways to establish a rating. You go, good, that's great, that's flexible. You put those in your methodology, but you don't put a preference, such that 2 different engineers on your own staff can go look at your own methodology. One guy can say, I'm going to use an IEEE standard from whatever year. The other guy says, I'm going to use a nameplate. You can come up with 2 different numbers. So the flexibility is good, but the weakness we see is you allow too much flexibility to allow a consistent application. So nothing wrong with having a tiered structure, say, this is what we're going to use unless we can't use this, or under these conditions use this, or under these conditions use this. There's nothing wrong with having that flexibility, but the methodologies, when they just refer to what the standard says and say do anything, it's hard to nail down, to have a consistent rating, even within your own facilities. The other piece, when you have other owners, coordinate with those other owners so that both people are coming up with the same value. It used to be a requirement that used to say that, in the case of any disagreement, always operate to the most limiting element. If facility owners did this, you'd probably never run into that situation. Everybody would be agreeing on those facilities. So that's that's my spiel on facilities and joint ownership. Like I say, standard issue coming out for the joint ownership. So there may be some more movement on that. So when that standard comes out, please participate, make comments, help out the drafting team. They got a bunch of good people together. They're doing extra work. They're trying to solve an issue that was brought to them by industry. So when they put something out for comment, be honest and see what you can help. But in the meantime, if you want to avoid any possible, you want to avoid any complications and PNCs and like that, the roadmap is there for you to do it. You may not want to do it, may not like to do it, but the roadmap's there. This is how we do it. The other question I get a lot is, well, nothing in the standard says the TO has to give the GO any information. That's not in the standard. Well, there's a lot of things that aren't in the standards. And we're not asking that you coordinate there based on the fact of what your registration is. We're asking that you coordinate based on that you're two companies that are connecting together and operating the same line. That's basic coordination. So if you can't get those ratings from your TO because you have asked and they refuse to give them to you, I don't see us finding a PNC for that. I see us making that an AOC, but we want to know who that TO is. We want to see what their process is. And they may get a visit. We've got several methods in our quiver that we can look at, because I don't think that's cooperating. I don't think that's operating the system in the spirit of reliability to do that, even if it's not explicitly listed in the standard. So maybe it's going a little bit outside, but we might be able to help you on that. That's what I'm saying. So prime movers. This is a question that came up, and hopefully this is a little bit better news than the previous section. So this is what a definition of prime mover is, and I got that from the U.S. Energy Information Administration glossary. So I'm not going to read it. Most of you kind of know what it is. I was surprised that they include solar cells and fuel cells as a prime mover, but basically it's the engine, and it doesn't meet the definition of a facility. So they're not part of facilities. A facility is defined by NERC. We know that. Nobody's arguing that. Nobody's trying to say that turbines are part of a facility. It's not an electrical device. So I want to make this really clear, because this was actually a comment when the standard was developed, and somebody was originally the standard proposed that they include prime movers. The drafting team said, no, you don't have to. So you don't have to. WEC will never require you to consider a prime mover or consider any mechanical limit in your electrical facility ratings. If you want to use just the nameplates of the electrical components, that's perfectly acceptable. But what we are saying as an option, realistically, if you do have a prime mover that limits your facility, you may use that providing you have the justification for it. It's not part of a facility, so it cannot be the most limiting applicable equipment that comprises a facility. But that's not the whole story. The question is, can it limit the output of the facility? Can it reduce the facility output rating? And the answer to that is, of course. And is there some technical basis for translating a mechanical limit into an equivalent electrical limit? Answer to that is also yes. So why can't you use it if you choose? Somebody buys a diesel generator set and with a generator on it, it's rated. They're matched pretty close down at sea level. Then they install the thing up at 7,000 feet, and you lose 3% of your 3% of your capacity to reach 1,000 feet elevation. So all of a sudden now your prime mover is not going to. It's going to be 21% less than what the generator is rated at. And that's a real limit. You're not going to beat that. So the other thing, the question is, we go back, does it matter to the user? Does the user does he want to know the electrical rating for some reason? Is that what he's interested in? Or are they interested in how many megawatts they can get out of that facility? That's a question that to be asked to determine, what does your customer want in this particular case? Because you have the option. Allowed methods for determining facility ratings. This is just a read for R1, that even if we said, oh, you can't do this prime mover consideration, if you did an engineering analysis, if you did commissioning test results, if you did performance, if that prime mover was actually your limiting value, that's going to show up as your limit, even without doing a horsepower conversion. But we do love nameplates. We don't like those engineering values. And it's just hard to read engineering evaluations and looking at historical data and figuring out how they're coming at that. So we love name. If there's a nameplate, we just drift right towards that nameplate. Show us the nameplate. There's a nameplate from a generator, and it does have everything that you need on there to rate that generator in almost any any units you want to rate it. But this is the generator itself. But in this case, this is just as from a discussion about generators. Normally when they make a turbine and a generator set, it is typical to make the generator slightly, has a little slightly higher capacity. You can overfire boilers. There's some things you can put on upgrades to possibly get a little more power out of the generator. And so you don't have, more power out of the prime mover. So the generator usually has a little bit of margin in it, so you're not limited by that. So what if this generator that from this previous nameplate, what if we say it has 135 horsepower turbine on it? And that happens to be, that's actually true in this case from that turbine. So this applies to that conversion piece, but it also applies to anything else you do in facilities. You need to be able to compare apples to apples. So most current carrying equipment is rated with a current value. Things like transformers sometimes will give an MVA value, generators give MVA. So you can convert those MVAs into current, but in order to actually find what's limiting, they need to be in the same units. Auditors tend to prefer current instead of listing everything in volt amps. So think about that. You have a transformer with an MVA. When you're looking at the pieces on the high side, convert that MVA into a current. When you're looking at the pieces on the low side, convert the MVA into a current on that side to come up with what is the most limiting component. So it's going to what the formula is for how to convert horsepower. You can convert horsepower into amps. 3-step process, spreadsheet, do it by just putting in a number. You do have to make the assumption of what you're going to use for power factor. So we do some math, and I was going to have everybody get out a calculator and solve these as a poll question, but that didn't work out so good. So we'll just look at it here. So that 135 horsepower, assuming you got a power factor of 0.9 and the voltage is at 13.8 kV. Okay, in accordance with the calculation about the prime mover can put out a little over 100 megawatts. That nameplate rating for the generator says 120. So you're legitimately limiting that facility based on the prime mover. MVA, same thing. MVA is going to be a little bit over 111, almost 112 versus 133 according to the nameplate. And the current, the most current you're probably going to get out of that generator is going to be 4681 as opposed to the 5578. So if you wanted to set your ratings based on the prime mover, it's allowed, it's not required. And that's a change. Like you said, no matter what you do, we're not letting you do the prime mover that's not part of a facility. So we're allowing that to happen now. Impact on facility. So here's the basis behind this. You can't create something from nothing. If the actual prime mover horsepower can only put out X number of megawatts, there is no way other than momentarily during faults that you're going to get more power than that out of the generator side. If it only makes X megawatts, generator can't make any more. So if you do choose to consider prime mover, that's fine. Just include the documentation as to how you made that rating determination so that the auditors can duplicate it. That doesn't mean you have to show all your math. Show us the voltage assumptions, the power factor assumption you made, so that if we wanted to check that, we could do it. A lot of auditors would like you to go ahead and make that conversion so that we can actually see. But if you give us the basic information, we can do that. The last thing here is for aggregation or total generation. And this is one that came up. It kind of relates to the prime mover issue in a way, but there's an emphasis on facility ratings for series components. But we all know in the case of wind farms, dispersed generation in general, that you have these strings of elements out there that are generating stuff, and then they go together and they go to feeders. The collector system is designed with a certain rating, and then you have the generators down there providing it. Now, a wind farm And we've seen cases like this, and maybe the idea is, even though, you know, the turbines at the wind turbines might be rated at X number of megawatts, we all know that typical output of a wind farm is going to be 15–20% of that. So the big question is, so if you say I'm going to put in more turbines to get more energy, but they're not necessarily going to operate at full all the time, maybe you don't want to spend the money on your collector system for the absolute maximum energy that you'll get 5% of the time. So we have seen collector systems that cannot handle the full output of the turbines. In that case, those collector systems, even if they're not BES, can indicate a limitation on that facility. In some cases, the collector systems are built robustly enough to take full generation for all the individual turbines there. Then maybe those turbines themselves can be the limiting factor. So what we're allowing to do is that you can look at all those, you can do your facility rating based on your electrical facilities. That's first. Then total up all the generation that you have out there. If that comes out to less than what the collector system or the electrical facilities can hold, that is an acceptable facility rating. Again, explain that. And also explain that it could be either or if you have multiple facilities. Otherwise, we had a case where auditor said, oh, it's inconsistent because they had two wind farms. One wind farm was limited by the electrical, one wind farm was limited by the wind turbines themselves, and their methodology didn't address that. So they weren't applying the methodology consistently. Those were legitimate ratings, but the methodology didn't support it. So make sure your methodology addresses it if you're going to do this, but it is allowed. So this is a little interesting. I sent this out as a quiz to our auditors. I got this photograph here, this diagram, right out of the BES definition document. And so it showed this is and they call it, this is a generator plant facility. So I looked at it, I said, so if I were doing a facility rating for this, what would I come up for this for a facility rating? And so those are the options there. So I said, let's make the assumptions 115 kV. So it is BES on that bus. That bus is 600 amps. The BES definition document doesn't go into those details. And I said, so what was the rating for this generator facility? And it was kind of interesting. It wasn't really intended as a trick question, but it really is a little bit thought-provoking. Every auditor except one said 600 amps. But then I'm thinking, well, what about that most limiting component thing? And I did say generator facility. And a generator facility technically is a generator to the step-up transformer, right? Per R1. All that got kind of ignored. They kind of focused on a different thing. So they went with the highest rating rather than the most limiting. So any one of those answers is possible depending on your perspective and how your methodology comes up and who those owners are. I'm making the assumption here it's all the same owner inside that box. But if you look and say 600 amps, yep, that's the most electricity you could ever see in that bus ever going out to the transmission owner. But realistically, you're never going to see more than 70 MVA because that's the total of all that generation there. Never going to get any more than that. And then if you look at BES, some people might say, well, I'm not talking about the BES generator. That BES generator is just that 125 MVA generator down there. So really the best answer is probably other, need more information. But you could justify with the methodology almost any one of those answers, depending on your perspective of who is the owner, what the facility was, and how you're considering that other generation. I know a balancing authority, they would want to know what I can get out of that whole generating station. Doesn't matter to them whether it's a non-BES, they still want to know what they can dispatch and what's going to be serving load. A transmission operator might be interested in the current carrying capability of that connection line there, the 600 amps. So something to keep in mind. This is a multiple generation facility. It's talking about also came out of the BES definition document. It's a wind farm. And same thing. So if you assume these are 2 megawatt turbines each, max output's 80 MVA. So those connection points in that transformer, if that's greater than 80 MVA or whatever the amp rating is there, it's acceptable to limit that generation facility output to the maximum output of those of the 80 MVA for all the turbines there. If the bus were sectionalized, I asked that question there. You're still looking at the connection point there, but if that bus were sectionalized, it's possible. And this is where we see sometimes it might not be able to carry all of the current from one of those strings or two of those strings. So that's something that every time there's a circuit breaker sectionalizing device, it's good to assess that on its own and see how it impacts the overall facility for these collector facilities. So in summary, be aware of how auditors classify facilities. You can hopefully avoid any issues if you're just aware how we're looking at these things and what can be considered a most limiting element. I think there's too much emphasis on the most limiting element thing. The most limiting element is, you don't have to set your rating equal to the most limiting element. Most people do, but all you have to do is respect it. That's just one line in the R2 and R3. Just one of the considerations is there is don't exceed the most limiting element. But you have to identify that to make sure it doesn't happen. Coordinate, communicate for jointly owned facilities. Can't emphasize that enough. And that's good even if it's not in the standards. And even if the standards don't say that you have to communicate, it's good utility practice. It's common sense. It's the way we're going to keep our system together. Minimize ambiguity in your own methodologies so that people know how to follow them and can come up with a consistent rating. And then you have the options of including prime movers and their impact on facility ratings. Just show what your conversions are. And you can sum generation resources and compare to your series electrical elements. And that is, we have any questions? I'm sure no questions.
Move this over. Yeah, I'll come up. We've got a couple questions here. But definitely I'm going to defer to you to answer because it gets out of my bailiwick fairly quickly. But we'll just go down based on the ratings here. The highest rated one here is, and it may just go to some methodology questions, but interested in your thoughts. You say the nameplate is the gold standard, but how would I reconcile a case where I have a breaker nameplate rated at 1200 amps with the line rated for 1200? What do we rate an old 1200 amp breaker with limited info to match a dynamic line rating that would exceed 1200 amp breaker nameplate rating?
So I'm trying to think of a question. If you're saying that when I said that nameplates are the gold standards, that's what we like because it's pretty clear. It's definitely a manufacturer's documentation. So you do have to set your facility rating to respect the most limiting component. So I'm not sure what we're saying here. If you've got a 1200 amp limit on a circuit breaker, you can't set your facility rating greater than 1200 amps unless you do some kind of analysis that can overrule that nameplate rating. And when you get to your adjustable ratings for conductors, ambient conditions, the same thing. You have to find the whole idea of the process here. You define your facility boundaries. You look at each piece of equipment within that facility boundary and determine its rating in some common apples to apples comparison, MVA or amps. And then what is the most limiting element there? What has the least capability of carrying current? And that's going to be your facility limit for that, unless you do something to change it. And there is a capability of doing an engineering evaluation. There's been cases where we've had limits that have SOLs even, and in real time, the RCs, TOPs have gotten together, they've sharpened their pencils, they've redone the numbers, and they've allowed operations in excess of that for certain periods of time. But ambient conditions were different. So you can do that during the winter time and maybe get away with it. That wasn't necessarily the facility ratings put out, but in coordination with the owners, the operators, and the RC, they were able to do that. So I don't know if that answered the question, but you have to respect the most limiting element that you designate.
Great. The next question, I've got a little perspective on it, but it's asking when WEC adopted the definition of a facility extending through the breaker, and has this always been the case? Thanks. And I guess, I would say that I think that there's instances where we might not have asked for evidence of things, but we're not creating a definition or creating a requirement or modifying the requirement, but we reserve the right, I think, to get smarter in terms of the information that we ask for. And I would parallel that even with the approach in the Euro enterprise generally over the last couple of years to begin to do walk down confirmation of facility ratings, because I think in the past we tended to rely on evidence that was presented, and then we started in some instances to walk down and discovered that operationally there was a distinct difference. And so there too is a case where the obligation under the requirements hasn't changed, but over time and as we've evolved our approach to look at things, we've determined that we look at it a different way. But
And I would like to add, there is some FERC basis for that in FERC's discussion of facilities, and they talk about what's considered a facility. And this is also in some old orders that I can't quote, but since it's in front page news right now. If you look at FERC 881, if you look at that order, there's a footnote in there that specifically identifies what FERC considers a transmission element. And in their words, they include circuit breakers, wave traps, and conductors and transformers as a transmission element. So I don't think, and I don't think that we are deviating from the other regions from a TO perspective with including those breakers. I can't promise you that specific questions have been asked, but I don't think that's unusual with the other regions. I do think that maybe for the generator piece, where you actually have two owners, it's not the same guy, that some are allowing a little more flexibility than WEC is. But all we're doing is applying a consistent perspective between how we treat a TO and how we treat a generator connection. So that's why that perspective came.
Great. Okay, this is interesting about confluence between the FAC standards and the mod standards. So can you explain why a planning entity would use a generator's FAC 8 ratings, which are the absolute best case, in lieu of mod testing results, which represent the actual functional capabilities of the generator?
I can't. I think a mod for the mod test and reporting the mods and that's mod 25, and then also mod 26 with the models that you have to provide for real power. I would think the planners would tend to want to use the test values. But understand, if you do a test for mod 25 and come up with a generator facility rating for mod 25, that's allowed per FAC 8. There's not a huge conflict there. You can do a testing for generator output, mod 25, come up with a value. That value, you can put that in your FAC 8 methodology. This is how we're going to set our generator ratings. We're going to use mod 25 testing. There's nothing wrong with that.
Great. Another question on joint facilities: is WEC looking for only the most limiting and next most limiting element for the other owners?
That should be enough. That's something I need to check on. I think that I've seen a couple of audit results recently where we are asking, it's hard to say whether we're asking whether the entity just provided it, but provided almost all elements from another entity. And then in this case was for example, this was a transmission line. It wasn't a generator owner, but it was one company owned a section of line, and there was a tap off this line. Another company owned two more sections of line going further down, and the entity we're auditing, they provided all that information. They got that from the other TO, so that was there. It's hard to say whether the auditors would have found a violation if that all hadn't been there. There is an implementation guidance that documents approved by NERC, written by MRO as an application guide. In there, it basically says that for these joint owned facilities, you should at least have the most limiting element. It's not required that you have the rating of everything, that you at least have the most limiting element. I also would think, hey, if you just got a formal statement that said this is the limit up to this point, I don't even care what the limiting element is. That can be found if needed. If that other, as long as that other entity is aware and they're applying their process, but I don't think it's required. So I don't know. I can't say if any auditors have found violations because all foreign elements weren't included.
Great. See a couple more here. I think we should have time for most of them. If a GO defines their point of demarcation in conjunction with the TO where the handoff occurs at the high side of the GSU, is the GO still required to rate the elements to the bus as you showed in your slides?
No, as long as the GO doesn't own equipment beyond that point. The high side of the transformer is one of the points that's identified in requirement 1 as being part of the generator. So if that's where the TO joins, that's acceptable. Then the generator owner is only responsible for R1. They don't have to do R2. The TO takes care of everything else. One other little thing a question that came up: what if you're a GO and a TO, you're the same company? Is the GO responsible for R2? I would hope not. I would hope that their process would identify that the TO would worry about all the connection up to the transformer or even through the transformer and make it clear as to who's responsible for what, rather than having to have an extra methodology. But that's another place, that's an option and a piece of flexibility that could cause some issues.
Great. Yeah, and I know some of these are very technical questions. So this is, I think, a great testament to the breadth of this workshop too. We've covered SIP in the morning, now all of this, and this is great. Another question about the ambient ratings. I think maybe you did address it in the presentation. It kind of came in commensurate with or concurrent with when you were talking about that. But it says AAR/DLR. Do you expect to assess requests for waiver based on facility limitations not tied to ambient conditions?
I don't think so. I don't think so. That waiver process at FERC Order 881 is not directed. It's not directed explicitly at FAC 8. And there right now, I'm not aware of any standards action that's going to put a requirement in FAC 8 to address anything like that. However you modify your methodology, that's what we'll be auditing to. Did you use your methodology to come up with your limits? But I don't think I don't think the plan is for the reliability auditors to audit the exceptions or exemptions in 881. And I think FERC didn't accept the DDR stuff. That's an option. They're not going to require DDR. They're going to require AAR.
Great. The next one, they're jockeying here for position. So this one is, what is the approach of walk downs of FAC 8 post-COVID? And just quick commentary I would make on this one, because I think it ties together some of the discussions we've had so far about internal controls, about performance, about the compliance oversight plan. And that is that, certainly I mentioned walk downs and the walk downs that have occurred and will continue to occur with respect to facility ratings in targeted ways. And what I would say about that is that, the answer is that it depends on a lot of factors, and a lot of it has to do with how well we're able, again, as a common theme, how well we're able to understand how the entity itself understands and mitigates its risks relative to facility ratings. And so a lot of variables would impact decisions that we would make about walk downs. In some cases, there's entities that have very strong programs that can show how they've connected to actual operations, and in some cases perform testing and walk downs themselves. And so that opens the door to conversation about, using the work of others with respect to the work that they've already done. And in other cases, there may be a total lack of documentation, or it might be indicative that there's a compliant set of information that doesn't match operational reality and could lead into decisions that we make about doing those walk downs. So again, it's all tied together insofar as how strong you're able to connect the activities you do related to reliability and security performance impacts decisions that we make and differentiates experiences that you have with us. So I don't know if you have additional. Yeah,
just to add that, just in case you think WEC doesn't listen to other regions, we do, as in fact, and the FAC 8 walk downs are something that we're going to implement at some level. And that's a lesson learned by some of the other regions that did the walk downs, and they discovered problems. And one of the issues in the themes document, if you read that, and that will be, I think the reference to that's going to be posted with the following presentation. But if you read that, we found out that, yeah, some people wrote great procedures when FAC 8 came out, but they never went back and looked at their legacy stuff. And so the other regions back east, they went and they did some walkdowns and they found some issues. And some of those issues were significant enough that it was sort of discussed in ERO wide. We think, hey, it is appropriate in some cases to do the walkdowns. How much effort and time we're going to spend in that, like I say, that depends on the feel and the confidence the auditors have in documentation and what you say you've done.
I think it's another perfect example too, if I may just connect to some comments I made yesterday in terms of not hanging your hat on just whether you all have the same scope, right? The proverbial water cooler of entities talking together and saying, you had FAC 8 scope? Oh, I did too. I thought that WEC was risk-based. Well, you know, what I think is missing in that conversation is that those two entities might have had very, very, very different interactions with WEC relative to FAC 8, depending on the strength of their controls, their program, their history. And so in one case, it might have been a more intensive, robust interaction with WEC. And in another case, it might have been focused on the discussion about what the entity is doing proactively. So scope is not just whether something is labeled as in or out of scope. It's about so much more, just to reiterate that point. Back to FAC 8 specifically, another question asks if you could discuss further a possible difference in the definition of facility between the audit team and the registered entity. And I'll just, you know, add again, we're not making definitions, but we have the perspective of 400 plus entities. And so, you know, when we interact, that influences what we see. But
I don't think that there's a definite difference in the definition of facility. What I said, if you look at the definition of facility, there's a little bit of wiggle room there as to what you consider operates as a single element. I think that's where the possible issue might come. But I think, you know, one of the reasons WEC was insisting that we had alleged some violations or some PNCs based on the prime mover was because we were applying the strict definition of facility, and a definition of facility does not include mechanical elements. So if you included one and you use that to limit your facility, that was not considered acceptable. And we alleged some PNCs there. We work with NERC and the other regions and our enforcement group to get that resolved. So we weren't doing that. Wasn't a knee-jerk thing. That took quite a while to get that resolved. Hey, this is an acceptable thing to do. So I don't think auditors aren't stretching or changing the definition of facility. It's just how, you know, what we're saying might consider as operating as a single element compared to what, you know, an entity might say operating a single element. And most of the time what we're seeing is the entities are focusing on ownership where the auditors are focusing on operation.
Great. Okay, under the proposed JOF definition, would the problematic configuration of GeoBus and TO breakers be considered a joint owned facility by WEC?
Did you read that again about the?
Yeah, maybe we'll have to take it offline, but just would the problematic configuration of GeoBus and TO breakers be considered a joint owned facility?
The problematic configuration.
In quotation marks.
Yeah, let's just say if that's the configuration, a GeoBus and TO breakers. WEC's perspective right now is those breakers would be included in the facility. So it'd be the GeoBus and the TO breakers. Right. That's what we look as drawing the boundary facilities, and we look at some coordination from those two companies to come up with what the facility ratings would be.
Great. And then I guess without weighing too much, without knowing the exact facts and circumstances, someone is interested in, if a customer owns a transmission line that is connected to a transmission line owned by a utility company via a T-trap connection, would this particular tap line be a jointly owned or solely owned by the customer?
I'm not sure that the configuration there. If I tend to think that connection would be part of a facility, and so that component there, if owned by another party, would make that a jointly owned facility. So that if current's flowing through that, there has to be a rating obtained. If it needs to be obtained from the other owner, so be it. That's a joint owned facility. That's what we'd be looking. I say, like Steve said, in some cases, you need to see a little bit more detail of the configuration. That's one of the complications I mentioned. So many different arrangements of buses and so many different arrangements of tap lines, jumpers, everything that you can do out there with facilities that sometimes it's a custom situation, entity by entity.
Great. And finally, it's another one related to nameplate ratings. So just, you know, if an auditor prefers nameplate ratings, what don't they like about using engineering studies instead? And how do we ensure that the auditor will accept it? Interesting question.
I think the biggest thing I've seen where auditors not liking engineering studies is when the evidence is we did an engineering study. I mean, if you provide the engineering study and it's signed and it's, you know, presented as quality evidence, I don't see the auditors having an issue with that. It's easy when you look nameplate ratings. I mean, although I have seen some case where people put wonderful pictures of a nameplate, like kind of like the one that I showed in the slides, but they don't link. There's nothing on there that tells exactly which generator this was. It doesn't identify if this is this the one in that facility or just one from the internet. So sometimes, you know, nameplates are good. They need to be linked to the actual facility. But I haven't seen too many engineering evaluations, but I do know there's been a couple of cases where entities have said, well, we do an engineering evaluation and that's fine, but then they don't offer the engineering evaluation. So that's not really decent evidence. So if you provide the valuation signed by an engineer that's done something, I can't imagine the auditors would not accept that.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have. I appreciate the presentation. Let's everyone give Phil a great round of applause and thanks. Right on time.
Thank you very much.